I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Kevin Denny, School of Economics and Geary Institute for Public Policy. Kevin will be presenting today on maternal labour supply and child development using GUI data. Now, if I could just say that owing to teaching, Kevin will have to leave a little bit early, so if a question, query or point of clarification does not get answered today, please feel free to email Kevin or talk to him another week. Okay, so Kevin.
Okay, thanks for coming. Thank you for the invitation, Nora. So as you know, if you're an economist, you know there's lots of research on labour supply, particularly on female labour supply, which is kind of more interesting than male labour supply, somewhat boring. Because women are more involved in firstly having babies and bringing them up and household duties and so on. So female labour supply is kind of more interesting. And you get a lot more women who are not working compared to men, although that margin is changing, is reducing. So there's lots of stuff on the presence of children and on family structure on labour supply. So number of kids, whether people are married or not, and things like that. Relatively little that we're aware of on child health and child development. I'm going to use those broadly for the moment, and I'll be more specific later. And when you say there's little research, you're always kind of conscious that I'm missing a whole bunch of papers. We haven't done an exhaustive literature search because it's kind of boring, but I'll talk about some of the papers. Most of the work that we've come across is US, and some is Australian. And there's a good reason to think that the results there might not generalise to other countries like European countries and Ireland. So why and how might it matter? I mean, you probably don't need much persuasion to think that how the child is doing, broadly speaking, could affect the mother's labour supply. This categorisation is due to a paper by a woman, Gould. So basically, child health can take up resources. It can take up time. He or she, child, can take up time. So that might expect you to reduce a woman's labour supply. On the other hand, child health can take up money if the treatment is expensive and there's no other resources. It's not free. Then that can have the opposite effect. Right? Women might work harder or longer to pay. You can also think of child health as generating uncertainty, right? So it's not just a matter of the severity of the illness, but sometimes you just don't know, right? So maybe that you know that you're going to have to drop everything to bring the kid to the doctor or something like that. So the uncertainty might make it difficult for a woman to commit to a job. And of course, all of this is going to be contingent on service provision, right? If health services for children and educational services and services deal with, say, child development, if they're all perfectly supplied for free, then, maybe these factors wouldn't be so important. But that's not the world we live in, certainly not in Ireland. So let me give you a brief run through some of the work that's salient. The first paper, it's a paper in a pediatrics journal, so it's a medical paper. And they look at the effect of child health on both parents' employment. So it's a binary outcome. Because it's a medical paper, they report odds ratios, which tend to affect my head. But what's interesting about it, I think, it's one of the earliest papers in this area, is they find big negative associations between child being ill and both parents' probability of being employed. And the effects don't seem to differ that much between the mother and the father, which I'd say I found very surprising. I could be wrong, but I just don't expect to see these effects on the fathers as much, if at all.
What data is that? Is it British, American?
It's American. I can't remember what. I know all the other data sets, I think, but not that one. This paper gets discussed a lot in the area, Powers, and she's looking specifically at the effect of disability on the mother's employment. Now the way this is using CPS, the American, one particular way from the CPS data, and there's a whole set of conditions that mothers are asked. Does the child have this, this, and this? So it seems like deafness, blindness, emotional disturbance, orthopedic problems, a whole bunch of what they call impairments. And then there's another question which is asked: do you think the child has is limited in their movement? So I'm just going to call that disability for simplicity. The way she thinks about it is that these are kind of objective and these are subjective, because you could think of why a mother's answer to that question could depend on her employment status. So for example, if she's not working, she might be more inclined to kind of big up the disability of the child as some sort of, ex post rationalization. And you can tell similar stories. So what she does is she uses these specific conditions as reported by the mother as instrumental variables for this. It's a reasonable argument, but I don't think it's a slam dunk. I'm not entirely convinced that these have no direct effects. That's what she's assuming. So I don't know. I mean, it's only published in the American Economic Review, so what can you do? This is the best paper, I think, in this area. Gould, this is using one way of the PSID, Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And because she developed this framework that I was just talking about, she's able to classify the illnesses into what she calls time-intensive conditions, severe conditions, time uncertain. And the way she did that, well, she took a bunch of conditions that are in the data, and she went to a focus group of doctors and said, can you classify these? We don't do anything like that, and there's a reason, well, a couple of reasons for it. She finds that the time-intensive conditions, right, so the sicknesses that take up a lot of time, affect single moms. The ones that are uncertain or severe affect the married moms. And she also has data on medical expenditures, and that, again, consistent with the hypothesis, increases the number of work hours, right? The woman has to work longer to make up the money. And then there's this interesting paper by a group based in Melbourne, Paul Frichters, Mike Shields, a woman Shah, and a guy Johnston. And they're looking at child development using, it's a 5-category measure. It's a bit like ages and stages questionnaire, if you know what that is. And the idea is, well, obviously child development could be endogenous to the mother working, it could be feedback. So they use handedness as an instrument. So specifically, left-handed children tend to be less well developed. With the sole exception of Chris Jackson. The reason why, one of the reasons why we got interested in this area is that they cite a paper by us, by me and Vincent, on left-handedness, and I know I've worked on it subsequently. So that's their clever trick, and that's why they got a good publication out of it. And they find that when you allow for that a child being more poorly developed has quite a big negative effect on the mother's employment, especially once you control for that, the effect gets a lot bigger. And this is another Australian paper that looks at disability, and they find a big negative effect on mothers' employment, especially on single moms. And in fact, it was, I think, really this paper, up to about, I don't know, maybe a week ago, we were just, we weren't distinguishing between single and married mothers. We were pooling them just with a dummy verbal, and then we thought, well, maybe we should split them out. So we're going to use the Growing Up in Ireland data. You've probably heard, some of you, all of you have heard a lot about this. There's two cohorts, the infants and the children. The infants were first sampled when they were 9 months between those dates. So that's when they were born, so that's when the data was collected. There's an interview with parents, well, certainly particularly if both of them are around. If the father has headed off, then they try to track him down, but they don't always. And then the child cohort, they were sampled first when they were 9, so data was collected between that. That isn't much, because they're more advanced, you've actually had interviews with the children, with the main carer, with the second carer, if available. There's also interesting questions from the kid's teacher, the school principal, and we'll be using some of that data. The second wave of each of these, so when the infants were 3, when the 9-year-olds were 13 are now available. The third wave of this, the 5-year data, is published, or was to be published, I think last month. It hasn't come out yet, so any day now. We're just going to look at the first wave of each cohort. I think my co-author has been messing around with some of the other ones yet, but I have to track them down first. So the GUI data is a fantastic resource and has really shown a tremendous amount, given us tremendous insight into the lives of our children in the country and our carers and their teachers. So we really know vastly more than we used to, and we have real knowledge now of, say, some of the challenges, some of the problems that children face. So here's an example. Look at the look of terror on the child beside James Riley. Unless it's a sociologist, maybe that's having the effect. I don't know. Okay, we're basically talking about binary outcomes here, to cut a long story short. We never find any effect on hours conditioned on participation. So this is really about whether the mother works or not, or whether the mother's in the labour force or not. So we tried looking at hours. I think Vincent might have found some effect somewhere, but I don't know, maybe one of the other ways. But in general, this is a binary story. I'm going to first talk about the 9-month, and then time permitting talk about the 9-year. But I don't know whether I'll get to it. I might just try and skip to the end and give you the bottom line if I don't have time. So the outcome, the variables of interest, right, that we're interested in is a thing called the Ages and Stages questionnaire. I'll tell you specifically what that is, but it's a measure of child development. There's 5 domains to it. And you can do this a couple of ways. One is there's a mean score, and secondly there's a pass rate. So if your kid is below a certain score, they're deemed to have problems in that area.
Kevin, just ask you one thing.
Yeah.
Are you distinguishing between part-time and full-time working?
No. We can, but we don't.
Okay.
I'll show you the marginals in a minute.
Okay.
So we could, yeah. So the employment data is quite different between the two waves. With the 9-year-old, you have a continuous variable on hours. With the 9-month, you have a categorical one. But I'll show you the marginal in a minute. On the health thing, we use a variable, it's called baby well, which basically means that they have no health problems. It's a 4-category variable, and we just take the first category versus all others, because that's really kind of where the action is. There's a lot of kids, thankfully, have no health problems, and then there's I can't remember exactly how many are in those categories, but it's small. So we make it binary. Now, this is not for the want of trying to look at other categories, other possible health variables. So the mothers are asked from a long list, what health problems does the child have? And it's all the usual kind of suspects. There's about a list of, I can't remember, 15 or 20 different conditions that the child could have. They're also asked, basically, what problems have you gone to a health professional with? That could be your GP, pediatrician, community nurse. We also know the number of visits to health professionals. Again, it could be GP, emergency room, and so on. And there's also a variable that picks up, if they have health problems, the severity of the worst problem. So we looked at those. None of those ever really kick in, so that's why we focus on this. There may be, what we don't do, to get back to a point I was making earlier, is we don't pick out particular illnesses as classify them and say these are the serious ones and these are the not so serious. Now you can try to do that, but the problem is, if you ask a doctor, is condition A worse than condition B, they'll say, well, it depends, right? Because a lot of conditions are going to vary massively. So you have a bad case, yeah.
Are they all kind of chronic ones, or do they ask about short-term things as well?
They're, I think, they're all chronic, yeah.
Okay.
So they're going to vary. The mother will know, or the doctor will know how serious they are, or we don't really know. Okay. So all we do is just count them. But if anyone has any ideas about how we should categorize them or prioritize them, we're open to.
And Kevin, are these self-reports then by the parents?
Yeah.
Do you have any
Now with
data?
the 9-year-old, if I get to it, there's when we talk about learning difficulties, they're asked, does your child have any of these 6 conditions? And then there's a second question which says, has it been diagnosed? So things like autism. But with these, it's the mother is asked, and then, well, have they been to a doctor about it, of these health conditions in infancy?
Right, because I thought one of the strengths of this data set was that it has a lot of information on kids'
But
health.
still, that
Yeah, but not from doctors. So it's all self-report. There was no interview with a doctor. Whereas, say, in the NCDS, they do talk to health professionals. And there's the medical data which is kind of inputted. So maybe in children, I don't know children that well.
So do you worry about like conditions like autism, that higher income parents will be more likely to notice signs of autism?
Yeah, well, it'll be a while before I get to learning difficulties if I do, but that is a good possibility. So, there's zillions of variables in this data set. You can't have them all, and then some of them you're not quite sure about whether to include them. But we try and put in the usual suspects. Mother's age, her education level, a health question, which is subjective general health. But there's a whole bunch of other ones that we could use. Whether they were born abroad and whether there's a partner. Or indeed, we'll separate out those who do and don't have partners. For the children, their sex turns out to be irrelevant. Older and younger siblings, so for the 9-month, obviously they don't have younger siblings. For the 9 years, they do. Whether they're a singleton or not. You know about the partner, well, if there is a partner, you know a lot about them. Age, education, health if born abroad, and their employment status. And then we also looked at whether there's other adult family in the household or just other adults. You can do either. Because clearly if there's somebody else around, maybe who can look after the baby, then that makes it easier for the woman to go to work.
So having good maternal health control seems important, since presumably a lot of this health stuff is genetic.
Yeah, so we actually consider there's a reasonable bunch of questions on the mother's health. There's a subjective general health, and then there's things about did you have a chronic health condition before the baby was born? Did you have it? Did you acquire one after the baby was born? There's one or two. There's at least one other. But we find that the only one that really matters is this subjective general health.
So the other ones are not correlated with the child's health?
The other ones, they're not correlated with labour factors. They don't kick into they don't have a direct effect, and I don't think they affected the results of interest. So this one has a big effect, a direct effect on, mothers who are in worse health are much less likely to participate. But it seems that's the only one that works, which is a little bit surprising.
It just seems important, because I would think a first order of objection to this is that, well, it's just sicker mothers have sicker children, sicker mothers are less likely to.
Yeah. Well, we control it as best we can for the mother's health.
Right.
Now, sorry. That doesn't say there isn't some better way of doing it that we haven't figured out. I mean, there's other. I'm not sure we could do much better, but I'm open to persuasion. So as ever, the issue is, do you have any instrumental variables? Now this is different between the 9-month and the 9-year, but I'm talking about the 9-month. The things we consider are, I think I've left something out here. Whether the baby was born preterm, whether there's the number of complications in pregnancy. So you know the specific ones, but we don't try and kind of pick winners. So we just count the number of complications at birth. We know mode of birth. We know birth weight, and we do that linearly. But we also created like a dummy for low birth weight, a dummy for macrosomia. But the linear one I think does okay. And we also have what I forgot to put in, because these results changed completely this morning, so this is a dynamic analysis. We have birth length, okay, which actually kind of comes in handy. So I mentioned this age is the stages questionnaire. What is it? It's according to the document, it's a means of monitoring child development through parental reports that any indication of delay can be investigated promptly. And these are the 5 domains: communication, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, problem solving, and socio-emotional. I'm sure there's people in this room who know more about this than me. But, so the way it was done was, there's questions for different ages, right? Ages and stages. And although the kids are all 9 months, they were asked a set of different questionnaires, right? One's corresponding to what you'd expect a 6-month-old, 8, 10, and 12. And obviously, the harder ones they are, the less well they do. And we just used the last one. The 6-month data 6-month questions isn't in the data, because basically every child passed with flying colours. And we used a number of domains passed, a number out of 5. Rather than that actually works better than the mean. I mean, sometimes these cut-offs, these thresholds can be a bit arbitrary, but in this case they seem to make sense. So I'm not going to go through the full descriptions for everything, but this part gets back to Dave's question. This is the weighted marginal distribution. 30% are in full-time employment, 26.5% part-time, and 43% not at all. Then when you split it out, you find that some fairly significant differences. This is the 2 questions we're going to focus on. So these are dummy variables. That's 82.9% of the children are perfectly well. That's good. Slightly lower for single parents, single moms. And this is the ages and stages questionnaire. So this is the proportion out of the number out of 5 that are passed. So I'm just going to show you a simple.
Sorry, Kevin, when you say they're passed, you mean they're coming out better?
They're doing,
The
yeah,
higher they are, the better they are.
yeah. It's a number. There's some cut off. I can't remember what the scale is. Somebody may know.
So
Pass is good.
So the sicker kids for the single moms are coming out better
Yeah, I
in
don't.
ASQ than the non-single kids. Is that right?
Yeah, but I wouldn't read too much into that. I don't know if it's significantly different. Yeah, I won't. I haven't tested whether the difference is significant. I wasn't worried about it.
Yeah, Kevin, your end there is quite small, 8,500. Did you start with the larger?
So this is the. This, I guess, must be for the regression sample that we. Well, is that right? Yeah. So that's we've lost a couple of thousand. That must be just from case-wise deletion.
Okay, it might be to do with the fathers. I'm not sure how you classified the single there.
What do you mean?
Well, you're missing about 3,000 in your N, and probably one of the only ways you'd lose that many is how you've classified the single. There's about 3 different classifications.
Yeah. I don't
Whether
know.
the father is around but not living with the mother, for instance,
Yeah.
or you have nothing at all on him.
So for the singles, it's we don't use any father's data. So that should be. But of course, there's other variables that may be missing.
Yeah, I think there's more in your, possibly in your single category. We'll have a chat with that offline.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't trace through where I lost them. I
Yeah.
should have.
Birth length, you lose a few as well.
Pardon me?
Birth length, you lose a few as well. Not everybody responds reports birth length.
Yeah.
You lose a good few hundred with that. I don't think they miss at random either.
Okay. Okie dokie. So these are simple. Okay, yeah, so I just did these squares. It's not that different with Probit. And so I don't show all the cover, all the controls, right, because there wouldn't be room. And at first blush, you find that mothers whose children are performing better on age and stages, they're better developed, are more likely to work. But somewhat curiously, the baby being well has a negative association. I'm careful to use that word. And when we split that out into singles and non-singles, it turns out that it's all with the non-singles. Right? These are women who have partners. So there's nothing happening with the single moms, which is a bit surprising. If I had to bet on it, I would have said the other way around, and that's partly because some of the earlier papers that have looked at this find significant effects for single moms, bigger effects for single moms than non-single. What we did here, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference, is this model is the same as this, so we don't have characteristics of the partner. But then we can add in characteristics of the partner in here. So that reduces the sample a bit. Doesn't change the results massively.
Is that a typo on the R squared? That you include everybody, you can explain 4% of the variation, but suddenly when you split the sample, you can explain, half the variation?
Yeah, that's
I would guess.
definitely wrong. Yeah, well spotted. I may be missing a 0 here or something. Yeah, no, that's nonsense. Well spotted. You get the prize. All right, we're doing great. Okay, so at this stage we abandoned the single mothers because we've basically never been able to find anything, we've never been able to find any effect at all whatsoever under any circumstances for this couple. I'll come back to that later. So, because the obvious question is, well, you might think that negative coefficient is just reverse causality, right? That it's implausible that the baby being well would actually reduce the mother's probability of being employed. So that would suggest some control for endogeneity is required. And sorry, I haven't quite abandoned the single mothers yet. I said people might be surprised at that. I was surprised. We find lots of other variables don't matter either. So I don't know if that's a clue. So things like whether the woman worked before, which you'd expect to predict whether a woman would work again, doesn't kick in. The mother's health doesn't kick in. Whether the child is a singleton or not doesn't kick in. And these all affect the non-single mothers working. So there's something, I don't know what's going on here. But the fact that all these things, which kind of you'd expect to kick in, don't.
How many controls for wealth in the household?
No. We have household income, but that would obviously be endogenous to labour supply. Now, one thing we did do, you could put in household income, equivalized income, and instrument it with, say, a father's education. But it's questionable whether you just don't just have the father's education in there directly. But there is nothing that I know of on wealth.
Did you know whether while they got to maternity benefit, it was
We don't know how much, we know, so I'll say a bit about that. We know whether they're in receipt of various payments, the child benefit, carer's allowance, whether there's unemployment benefit, there's a whole bunch of those things. Now clearly some of them are going to be endogenous. So the child benefit, right, so non-means tested benefits, they'll all be getting child benefit.
I'm wondering about whether, because some employers will make up the difference between what to declare during the official maternity leave period, will make up the difference between what the mother gets.
Yeah.
And so those might, there's some countries especially, you wouldn't let them, or a mother would be considered a bad mother if she went back to work before the baby was a year old. So it might be easier to do that, to take the unpaid maternity leave for mothers who actually got
Yeah, well, a lot of what was, I don't know, surprising was, if you look at that table I showed you, is an awful lot of mothers do go back, even after 9 months. It's slightly
Yeah, no, I
surprising.
know, just in Ireland it's different.
So there's something a bit peculiar about the single moms. So I'm going to. So this is just a bunch of other models with the single moms where we just experimented with different health variables, right? So we're changing the health variable as going across. So in case you thought, well, that dummy variable we're using was no good, we tried instead the number of health problems, the number of health problems that have been treated medically, the number of visits to health professional, and a measure of the severity of the worst health problem. And none of them kick in. So I think we've kind of given this enough, as good a shot as we can.
It's so gloomy in here, I can't see. Okay. So back to the non-single moms.
So we need variables that predict the child variables of interest at 9 months but have no direct effect on mother working. And as always, you can argue about people's validity of people's instruments. This is what we've done, and at present it's the best we can do. So we use data on the pregnancy and the birth. Well known that lots of these things have effects on the child. Now, they could indeed have a direct effect on the mother's labour supply if pregnancy was rough enough, or the birth, but we're relying on the assumption that we're controlling the mother's current health, so that any effects of these instruments is only working through the child's health. That's a kind of key, I suppose, identifying assumption, that we've controlled enough for the mother's current situation so that these things, which happened 9 months and more before, only affect through the child. So we just grouped them into two sets, no particular reason, I suppose. One is whether the child was born preterm, and the second is the number of birth complications. I suppose these are things that happen kind of relatively early. These are things that happen at birth, and then birth weight and length and the number of pregnancy complications. So we're going to use them separately and together. And as I mentioned earlier, we experimented with non-linear functions of birth weight, so low birth weight, macrosomia. Macrosomia is greater than 4 kilograms, becoming a growing problem in Ireland, as you may know. We also tried mode of birth, and nothing really happening there. So this is the model when we use these instruments. And more or less as you'd expect, a child being born preterm, it's not going to be good for them, okay? And in this case, it's bad for them. It means that they have a lower ages and stages questionnaire 9 months later. Although the birth complications don't do anything, but in the baby health equation, it's the other way around. And often all our instruments seem to work in one equation but not another, and they never work simultaneously. What does it do? Well, not a whole lot, in the sense that, well, nothing happening there. It reverses the sign on this. Remember, sorry, this was negative, that's still negative, this was positive. So actually nothing really has happened there. This is when we use the other instruments, and again, the birth weight and birth length are kicking in again in the way you'd expect, right? Positive effects. Complications in pregnancy does nothing there, but has a negative effect on the baby being well 9 months later. And then you're kind of starting to get some action in that you're finding that a better developed baby, the mother is more likely to be working. So these are all linear probability models, so you can think of those as percentage effects. That's not significant at the usual level.
That looks enormous, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
That's
does.
way too big to possibly be the case.
We don't always find that with that variable.
But it should be between 0 and 1, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we did a probe it, you would get. Actually, I did this with a probe it, with an ID probe it, and the effects were big, but they weren't that big. Now, even with an ID probe it, the marginal effects can be kind of very big, but. So this model is over-identified, it passes the usual, the J test, the Hansen-Sargent test. And then we thought, well, why don't we just put them all in together. Well, this is a much more sensible number now. And then the ages and stages is kicking in. And again, each equation you have about 2 or 3 instruments kicking in. but never at the same time. So the coefficient on the baby's health, which is a dummy, goes from a rather strange negative number to a more plausible positive one, although it's not statistically significant. This is just a standard deviation of it, if you want to get an idea. And the coefficient on the ages and stages questionnaire goes up massively. So the standard deviation is 1.33, so one standard deviation improvement in the child's development would increase the probability of working by 20 percentage points. Yeah, how am I doing for time?
22.
Okay. I probably won't have time to fully go through the 9-year-old data, but let me certainly introduce it. The child cohort data is not directly comparable, partly because necessarily 9-year-olds are different from 9-month-old. You have much less health data. Surprisingly, I mean, even you would expect less. There's actually very little from what I can see. But there's a range of other data on the kind of child's development. So you've got instead of the ages and stages, you have strengths and difficulties, SDQ, which is kind of similar. And there's some other measures of kind of socio-emotional development that we don't use. But you do have education data, which turns out to be quite interesting. So the health outcome that we look at is a question similar. What was the study child's health in the past year? And it's provided in these 3 categories, and we bunched the first 2. So very healthy, healthy with a few minor problems. Sorry, it's 4 categories. Sometimes quite ill, always ill. And sorry, that's 3. So that's one. That last thing is one questionnaire. So it's a dummy variable of these 2 categories against this. And there's not many kids, thankfully, in that last category. But we also used indicators of chronic illness and hospital visits, but these are the ones that kind of won out by a long shot. So we learned to use academic performance. And the kid's teacher was asked to rate the students' performance in 7 categories. So it was reading, writing, maths, comprehension, creativity, and I can't remember what the other one is. Memory. So we just code that a variable called low performance equals 1 if they're below average on 5 or more, 5, 6, 7 categories. We also just use the count, just the number of them. The results are very similar. You do have maths and reading tests, the so-called Drumcondra tests. They don't kick in. You might think that these are objective measures and these are subjective. On the other hand, the teacher actually probably knows the kid quite well, so maybe a better judge of how the child is doing. Again, we were surprised at this, so we thought, well, we'll give it a chance. We could put it in relative to school peers, how the kid is doing relative to the other kids in the school. We put in quartile dummies to see maybe there was some nonlinear effect, but zip. We put in strengths and difficulties, nothing happening. And then we also put in presence of learning difficulties, which I think may have been in the original abstract or title, I can't remember. So the mother is asked, does the child have any of the following learning difficulties? And it's dyslexia, dysgraphia, autism, ADHD, something called slow progress, and one other one. And first we just looked at the number, then we thought, well, maybe some of these are more likely to have an effect, that are going to be more demanding on the mothers, so we separately looked at autism and ADHD, and there's somebody in the audience who suggested that. Mairead, that was Mairead's idea, thank you. And for a while it looked like it might have an effect, but it kind of washed out in the end. Now we put in, at this stage we know a lot about the kids' school. We put in a lot of school characteristics, and the idea is that the school might serve as a substitute. In other words, if the kid is in a really good school, the mother mightn't feel so bad about going to work. Then if the kid has a problem, they mightn't feel so bad if they're being well tended to in school. We put in a bunch of variables. We tried more: large class size, the average reading score, teacher's experience, measure of school problems, adequacy of facilities, a bunch of other things like whether there's an SNA in the class, how many hours the SNA works, behavioural problems in the school, whether it was a single year class. Now, an obvious question is, well, maybe education economists are obsessed with the endogeneity of school choice. We relied here largely on a paper, a nice paper, by Eddie and Doris Donlaney and Al Sweetman. They use the GUI, the same cohort. They're looking at something else, like the single-sex schools. And they argue, or I think they show reasonably, I think fairly clearly, that for these kids going to primary school, this is probably not a big factor. Like their paper hinges on this not being a factor.
Kevin, do you have any information on aftercare availability? And schools will differ, and some will have on-site aftercare versus not. Because that could also make the mother more likely to go back if you can just drop off.
So that would be in the principal questionnaire. I don't remember seeing it, but I wasn't looking. Well, I don't think so. That's my best guess. Sure, grand. That's the time. Those are the descriptives. So now I've switched to looking at in the labour force as opposed to working. It doesn't make any difference, right? Because not many of these mothers are unemployed, right? So we could have had, I think just for some reason I started looking at the 9-year-olds and then went back to the 9-month where the labour force data isn't as good. So those are the means. Obviously nearly every child is well, and this is the proportion who have low academic performance, which is higher for the single moms, which you may find more intuitive. So this is just simple OLS probit. And children who are doing badly in school, the mother is less likely to be working. Child who's well, the mother is more likely to be working. All fairly intuitive. But the interesting thing is that it's all on the single moms. It's the reverse. The non-single moms does nothing. And why that's so, I have no idea. That's more consistent with the earlier literature. This is when we put in the autism ADHD dummy, and well, it's not significant at the 95% level. So dad is not quite accurate, it's partner. Okay, but I couldn't fit partner in. Obviously partner is usually dad, but not always. So unlike the infant cohort, the effects are on the single mothers, if any, and we only find, so here we can look at hours, and we find nothing on hours, it's all on participation. Again, instruments are, I think, kind of harder here. What we use is birth weight, and it's square. And the funny thing is, it does predict academic performance in a way that you might expect, but it doesn't affect child health. If anything, I'd expect it to kick in here rather than here. So what we do is we use these just to instrument this variable, and we treat child health as exogenous. That seems the best thing to do. Now, because these are both binary, we did this by variate probit. Right, so we're treating child well as exogenous. We're using quadratic and birth weight as instruments. There's also a paper, some of you may or may not know, that shows that bivariate probit is identified without instruments, provided you have enough continuous variables on the right-hand side. But actually, it's not that widely known. But under certain circumstances, the bivariate probit works fine without instruments. And those are the effects you get. So this is with birth weight, quadratic and birth weight. This is doing without it. Results are similar. And you're finding these are marginal effects, big effects, low academic performance, deterring a woman from working. These are all single mothers. And the child doing well, yeah, it's not significant, but it's positive. So this is the marginal effect from the first stage, right? So this is, I'm saying that birth weight affects the child's probability of being a low performer, okay? So this is the marginal effects from that first stage. So it's negative, right? Meaning that if you increase the child's birth weight, it lowers the probability of them doing badly at school. So that's what you would expect, okay? But the effect tails off as the child gets bigger, and it gets to here, so it's zero, but very precisely zero. Okay, so actually got some conclusions. So our research question is, does having childhood health or other problem act as disincentive to work? For the 9-month-old babies, we can't find anything on single moms. But the ASQ measure, child development, does affect the non-single moms. The child effects are not very well determined, but they are positive. For the 9-year-olds, it's just the other way around. The non-single mom are not affected, the single ones are. And it seems that poor academic performance, the child lagging in school, acts as quite a big barrier. And again, there's some evidence that child health matters, but so these are in some sense parallel the results for the 9-month-old. It's just for a different population.